For those of you that are joining and just jumped on, go ahead and take about a minute or two and then we'll start. I'll start just about 2 minutes after the hour. We got a lot to get through, so I want to make sure we have plenty of time. We're not rushing. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. I know there'll be a few probably still trickling in, but I'm going to get started as we have quite a bit to do today. So first and foremost, thank you all for being part of this particular Eleiko Strength Talk. We're going to talk about part 2 of maximizing your training results, and we're going to look at how to prevent and overcome injury, because that's going to be one of the biggest hindering factors in your training results. This is a continuation of part 1. So part 1 was based upon the role that recovery plays in our training results. And recovery and prevention of injury and overcoming injury are intimately tied together. And that's actually crucial, because without the recovery and without the prevention of injury and those little musculoskeletal nagging aches and pains that we get, that's what hinders us from advancing in performance or sets us back. So that's what we're going to get rolling with today. So first and foremost, real quick, a little bit of administrative. There's a downloadable PDF that you can look at on the download section. So there'll be a handout section. Depending on which version of GoToWebinar you're using, the old or the classic version, there's a kind of a toolbar or a control panel that often runs along the side, especially if you're on a computer. And you'll see it's called handouts. You can click on that, you can download from there. If you're using the new version, that's going to be across the top. So you're going to look for something that'll talk about handouts and you'll be able to click on that. I'm also going to be asking some polls, so your information will help me. And then we will also, obviously, I'm going to address as many questions as I possibly can for you all. There is a questions tab. If you click on that, you can type in a question. As I don't have my compadre, Patrick Warmel, he's on vacation. He's been doing a lot of tactical training. He's our tactical training education manager. He's been doing a lot of courses, so he's taken a couple weeks off on vacation. So I'll be answering as many as I can. So I'll be looking back and forth at my computers, and I'll try to leave time at the end to answer them. Feel free to ask them as we go along, or to post them as we go along. And I will try to glance up there and see it. But the most important thing is I want to get through this, and then we'll answer questions at the end. Okay, so I hope that helps to start with. What I want to do here real quick is just ask you all a quick poll that gives me some information so I know who I'm talking to. Is which of the following best represents you? You strength and conditioning coach, personal trainer, athlete, fitness enthusiast, owner, operator, or other. You can just fill that in real quick. That gives me a huge direction as to what I can and should be talking about for you guys, or how to direct it more specifically. All right, fantastic. So we got a lot of strength conditioning coach, personal trainers. Awesome. You please pay attention to this. If you're an athlete, fitness enthusiast, we're going to talk about, I'm going to use some big words, big phrases and technical things. I'm going to try to break it down and make it simple. The importance of that is we dumb things down so much that people don't really understand what we're trying to do and how the body works. And therefore, we pick strategies to try to overcome injury that may not be neurophysiologically accurate. And that's what's happened in the industry. So that's where we're going. So thank you guys for that information. The last poll I want to share right now is this your first Eleiko Strength Talk, yes or no? Just so I know if you're familiar with what we do and how we do it. Okay, so we have quite a bit of no's, so it's about a 70-30. 2/3, okay, beautiful. So 2/3 of you know. That third of you that have returned, thank you for returning. The 2/3 that are new, fantastic. Thank you so much for your support. I hope you get a lot out of this. And again, this is going to be just a very small microcosm of what we can and should be doing. So it's just a real quick, we're kind of skimming stones. We're going to go through a lot of detail. So let's get to some of the detail. So first off, let's get into what injury is. So there's two aspects to this, and I'm going to keep it very simple. There's acute injury. Acute injury is when we exceed tissue tolerance. That's as simple as it gets. And we're talking about musculoskeletal injuries, so we're not talking about non-contact. We're not talking about contact-related injuries and whatnot. It's just the acute responses. We've exceeded the tissue tolerance. I'll discuss that a little bit more as we go along. From a chronic standpoint, it means that we've had something happen to us, but if we have chronic pain or chronic injury, it means we've had an incomplete or improper recovery. So those of you that haven't seen part 1 to this, in the handout that you have to download, there is the link to that. You'll have a link to a bunch of resources in that handout. So I strongly suggest you do that. If you're not on a computer or somewhere you can download it, email me, email us, and I will make sure that I'll send that download to you so we have those links, because there are some very, very good resources for you in that. Okay, so exceeding tissue tolerance is what happens acutely. From a chronic standpoint, we have incomplete or improper recovery strategies, and that's as simple as I can make it for why we get injuries and how they turn into a chronic injury. So let's really quick review on part 1, depending on who wasn't here. In part 1, we did a couple things. We defined our terms, which is vitally important. First off, we have to understand what stress is. Stress is the major key to this, because stress is what creates the injury response, if you will. It's related to inflammation, as we'll find out later on. Stress is every sensation, and this is what people typically don't know. It's every sensation, every sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, movement, everything that you do is a stressor to the body. Stress is not good or bad, it's just stress. How you manage it and how the body processes it determines whether it's going to be good or bad for you. Again, go back to part 1 and we'll detail this a whole lot more. I'm going to give you the quick skinny right here. Recovery. Recovery is stress management. Recovery is how we manage stress. It's a continuous response. It doesn't just happen at the end of a training session or the end of the day. It's constantly happening. You have thousands of stressors every day, tens of thousands of stressors every day. Every one of those triggers the ability for the body to respond to it. And I'll show you what that looks like in a minute. So notice recovery is the management of stress, and it's a continuous process. It never ends. It's always going on 24/7, 365, 366 on a leap year. The recovered is the key. There's a difference between recovery, going through or entering into the recovery process, and actually getting to a recovered state. I'll show you what that looks like in a second. That's managed stress. That means you've completed the process enough to where you've gone to, at minimum, a state of norm, if not hopefully a greater state, because the body has adapted based upon your recovery. And then there's the readiness. Readiness is key because that's signifying your level of fatigue, your current level of fatigue and recovery. So it's determining what your current level of ability is. So before you train, you're going to have a certain readiness level. That readiness will change throughout the whole day. So it doesn't matter what you felt like when you woke up. If you train at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you're probably not going to feel the same as you did at 5 a.m. in the morning. If you train at noon, it's probably going to be different than it was at 8. And it's all going to depend on how much stress has entered the system and how well you recovered from that. So here's kind of a schematic breakdown of that. When we get incoming stress, and this is going to be thousands of times every day, it's not just a one-shot deal. Incoming stress triggers the fatigue response, which is where we get the inflammation. It also it immediately triggers a fitness response, but you can see that the fatigue is going to immediately be greater, and that's going to depend on the amount of stress at that particular time or the stressor. The stressor creates the fatigue. That's what stimulates inflammation. Inflammation is necessary and it's good, just like stress is necessary and it's good. Okay, so inflammation and stress aren't bad. We have to have those to live. It's how long the inflammation stays in there that's going to be the key. Okay, so we see as we get into the recovery process, and think of the bucket over there, we have all the incoming stress, we're just dumping water in. We've got to be able to get that water out to circulate, otherwise it's going to overflow and we get totally distressed. Recovery is the returning or the decreasing of fatigue. It's the returning of the system, and you can see as your recovery goes, so does your readiness. The better recovery, the better readiness, because you have better fitness. When you get to a certain level, you're in a recovered state, and you can see there's an optimal readiness and an optimal fitness. And if you see the bucket over there, the red line means we've gotten the recovery, we've pulled out the water, the fatigue, the stress to a sufficient amount to where now we have an optimal recovery or readiness state. You'll notice it doesn't go all the way to the baseline. That's because if you get there, you're dead. You always have stress in the system. There's always incoming stress, and we need it. We live in a world that has gravity. Most of us do anyway. So that gravity is vitally important to keep our body processes stimulated. So that's why you'll never get to a completely flatline recovery state. You don't want that. All right, hope that makes sense. That's really fast, but go to part one. Now, if we don't have a way to assess, and this is the key, if you can't assess where someone's readiness is, where yours or somebody you're training with, then you may be hitting not a fully recovered state. And if you don't have a way to assess that, you won't know. So if you're training someone in that the yellow line on the left versus the right, you train someone that's in that state at a level that you're thinking they're in an optimal state of ability or readiness, then you're actually putting way too much stress on that system. You do that repeatedly or on an inconsistent basis to where it's a hit and miss, that's where you're inducing more stress into that system than they can handle. You will get them, or they will eventually break down. If you're an athlete or a fitness enthusiast and you're training, but you don't know what your readiness is that day, then you could be overtraining and or even undertraining. And depending on what you're going to do, undertraining too much or overtraining too much can still lead to injury. Especially in an athletic standpoint. And even more, if you have farther down the road, it's just a different incident. So that's why we talked about the assessment last week, and that's what we used in the raw score. The raw score is in that downloadable chart. You can click on it and get that. That shows you can have a real quick system to gauge yourself, and we'll talk about that later at the end. Okay, so that's part of how all the stress works. The other thing is every form of recovery that you use, massages, massage guns, foam rolling, anything, you pick whatever you do, hot and cold tubs, saunas, all these things, red light therapy, all those are awesome, but just because you do them does not mean you're going to get recovered. They may promote recovery, but if you do too much, they're still a stressor to the system, because stress is every sensation. Any light, sound, any type of movement, vibration, any type of stretching, all those things are still stressors to the system, and they still can induce stress into the body. If you can't get it out, it's not going to help. This is one of the most critical factors for people, is they think just because I do something that is told or said in the industry to promote recovery does not mean it's going to actually get you recovered, because it depends on how much you're doing. This is what we're going to talk about here. We're going to show you how the body actually moves, and then how it needs to be treated or implemented, or things that you need to do to it to help it recover properly into a recovered state. Again, hope this makes sense. And the last thing is tissue dynamics. We talked about there's all these different things we can do with tissues, how much range of motion we take them through, how fast the motion is occurring, how much forces you're putting on it, how much time or attention you have, and the contractions that you're using. All of those are on a continuum. You can have lower and slower, or you can have higher and faster. Higher and faster equals more force, more stress into the system. Lower and slower equals less force, less stress into the system. So depending on where someone is, what their readiness is, that's why you have to understand and know how to assess how ready is someone should determine where you're moving them on that scale, or how much volume of that you're going to do with that person or yourself in that day. So again, go back to part one if you don't understand or that's not super clear, but we have to understand how much stress we're putting in the system, not because it's bad, but because we need to know how much we're putting in. So we need to know what needs to happen from a recovery state and how long are we going to have to recover. So let's look at movement. How do we move? This is something that has not been very well talked about in the industry, and so I'm hoping I'm going to make it simple for you and give you a good ballpark picture, because we have a very incomplete view of it in the industry. First off, there's a big word called sensory motor integration. We produce contractions and movements, both voluntary and through reflexive processes, and it's all determined by incoming sensory information. That's basically stressors. So any sensation, so our vision, our sight, our balance, all these things, the vestibular, all of this reception comes in, but especially from the proprioceptors. Proprioceptors are little receptors, and one of the biggest ones that we're going to talk about, and I'll show you, give you research and all that great stuff, is the muscle spindle. Muscle spindles are vital as a proprioceptor because it gives feedback to the central nervous system. And based on that feedback and all this information that we give the brain, it then processes it and it determines what proper movement strategy or motor response. And that's like, what motor units or muscles am I going to activate, and to what degree can I do that in order to produce a movement? Extremely important. The keynote: we move based on feedback received from our receptors, especially the proprioceptors, especially a muscle spindle or the muscle spindles, okay? Good feedback coming in means good movement going out. Bad or altered feedback coming in is going to produce bad or altered movement going out. So we need to be able to, how do we assess that and how can we address that? So let's talk about the muscle spindles. So first off, muscle spindles have been noted as being the most important proprioceptor. Not that the others aren't important, but the spindles are the most important because of the function they perform and because of where they're located, because the muscular system is extremely vital and intimately connected with every other system in the body. As your muscular system goes, so does the health of the body. And they're finding out more and more information about this that I can't go into right now, but I assure you. What they do is they inform the central nervous system whether or not muscle fibers, motor units, which are components of muscles, are online or not. Are they online, able to work right now? Yes or no? That's what it tells the brain. If they're working correctly, yes. If they're not working correctly, no. They're sensitive, and here's another key. This is what's not talked about in the industry. Muscle spindles are sensitive to change in muscle's length. They're always called a stretch receptor, and that's technically incomplete. They are a length regulator. They are a length receptor because they work both long when the muscles lengthen and shortened, or the fibers lengthen and shorten. And the shortening is actually vitally important, more so than just the lengthening if we had to pick one. Muscles have to shorten for any type of movement to occur. And this is what's not talked about. We are in a stretch dominant industry or philosophy in the industry. Everything's about how long can we get a muscle? How much range of motion do we have in the muscle? What we forget is that in order for range of motion to occur, things have to lengthen and shorten. We only think about lengthening. In order for anything, any joint, any movement to occur, something has to shorten in order for something to lengthen. We don't look at the shorten, we just think, hey, can we pull this? Can we push that? Can we move that to a longer state? Thinking that's going to help, but we're not understanding the neurophysiology behind it, and we're getting an incomplete recovery process. And that's why we have a lot of reoccurring and chronic injuries that never go away, which is also why we have a lot of YouTube videos and Instagram videos of doing weird things that don't have to happen. Okay, so For muscles to shorten, whether actively or passively, whether we actively control them and use our nervous system to move them, or whether we passively move that, for them to shorten like that, the muscle spindles, which is the feedback to the nervous system, must be functioning properly. Even if you passively move someone, the muscle spindle in the muscles that have to shorten have to be able to shorten as well. If they don't, then we have a system that's offline, and I'll show you what happens as we go into that later. So the way that this works for the muscle spindle and the muscle, and why they're so intimately connected, because they're intimately connected. Muscle spindles are directly connected and coordinated. They're synced up with the muscle fibers. So we have the little spindle that's within, it's embedded in muscle fibers, and there's dozens, hundreds of them, depending on the muscle. And that's what's feeding information to the nervous system. So we can see here that the muscle spindle, which is on the right-hand side, it's that little oblong shaped with the spiral around it. The muscle spindle provides feedback to the central nervous system about the muscle's length and activity. What's happening to the muscle? Is it lengthening? Is it shortening? So it's feeding, remember, sensory motor integration that we talked about, we only move based upon the feedback that we get. If the feedback's good, we move good. If it's not good, we won't move good. This feedback is used for the sensory motor integration and also for something called reciprocal inhibition, which is extremely important. We're going to get to that next. To tell the muscles when to lengthen and shorten and how much to do it. So that spindle, and by the way, this is one of the main pathways that the body uses to give us proprioception. Proprioception is one of those fancy words, and what proprioception actually means is stability. Proprioception means we have proper information coming in so we can have proper information going out. And if we have good proprioception, that means we have instant joint stability. We have proper activation so joints are stable. It's an unstable joint that causes the musculoskeletal injuries is essentially what happens. And I'm going to break that down here in a minute. If we have proper proprioception input coming into the system so it can go out clearly, we have good muscle activation, good timing. It means things are turning on when they're supposed to and turning off when they're supposed to. That creates a stable joint, and that allows for full range of motion. So range of motion is dictated by the proprioception. So the keynote here is that when we have this happening, we have reciprocal inhibition, proper and functional reciprocal inhibition. So the alpha gamma coactivation means when the spindle is moving, it's telling the muscle what it should be doing. When the muscle moves, the spindle moves. When the spindle moves, the muscle moves. The muscle can only do what the spindle will allow it to do, especially in a shortening capacity. Okay, so they're connected. Alpha just means those are the motor neurons that are going to the muscle fibers, and gamma are the neurons going to the muscle, and the gamma neurons are going from the spindle to the nervous system and back to the spindle. So those two things have to work together. They're in concert. If not, then we have poor information. Okay, so reciprocal inhibition. Reciprocal inhibition is when the muscle spindle is sending information to the brain, like we just talked about, to tell the muscles what to do. And in this case, when we talk about the reciprocal inhibition component, it's when muscle fibers and their spindles shorten, the opposing muscle is allowed to lengthen. So think of this diagram right here. This is an overly simplistic information, but let's keep it very simple. If I take that bent knee, and whether they actively extend it or whether I passively extend it, either way, that quad, that muscle, it has to shorten. As long as the spindle can shorten, and the spindle has to be able to shorten in order for the muscle to shorten. It's not the muscle shortens and then the spindle catches up. It's the spindle is able to shorten and then the muscle will continue to shorten. As long as that happens, then that hamstring or the opposing musculature will be allowed to lengthen. because the brain will reciprocally inhibit the other muscle, the hamstring muscle, when the quad is shortening. So as long as information from that spindle says we're shortening, we're shortening, we're shortening, we're shortening, shooting it to the spinal cord or to the central nervous system, it'll send an impulse down to the opposing muscle saying, go ahead and lengthen, go ahead and lengthen, go ahead and lengthen. It's basically turning the volume knob down of the activation for the opposing musculature, the hamstring in this case, as long as the spindle is working. So that's one of the keys here. As long as the nervous system is receiving input from the muscle spindle that the muscle is shortening, the opposing muscles will be allowed to lengthen to a full range of motion. The keynote, muscle spindle function dictates muscle activation and range of motion. As the spindle goes, so goes the activation of the muscles. Meaning, was something turning on so something could turn off? Was the quad turning on, the spindle turning on? Was it able to send information so the hamstring could turn off? If so, we have full range of motion of that knee extension. Vitally important. And then last, we have something called the size principle, and this is another key factor. So we have different sizes of muscle fibers and motor units. Muscle fibers make up motor units. Motor units are just the muscle fibers and the nerves the nerve that activates it. So just think you have a nerve and it activates so many fibers, that's a motor unit. There's type 1, type 2A, type 2X, type 2B in essence. Those are the general forms. Type 2-1s have the lowest activation threshold. They have to activate first. The reason this is important is because, well, one, it's a lower threshold that they have to activate on. So each of those come in at different places. When we have what we call motor unit recruitment, type 1 comes in first. When things get over 30%, then type 2A kicks in. And then when we get over about 60-65%, type 2X, and then we get over about 80-85%, then type 2B kick in. And then there's summation and there's synchronization, there's all that stuff. So there's all these different things that we have the ability to increase the activation so we can have proper activation what we have. But if the type 1s have to activate first, they are vitally important because they are what immediately are stimulated to have instant contraction, either immediately or prior to the joint going through motion, to create that proprioceptive feedback, which is stability, so the joint is stable. They must activate immediately. That is essential for joint stabilization. And they have to remain active throughout the contraction, depending on, and it doesn't matter what it is, because that's how we increase either how much input's getting into those muscle fibers or how many of them are being recruited based on load and activity, whatever. So they're low threshold, instant activation, essential for joint stabilization, and they have to remain active. So now, how do injuries occur? So we've talked about how the body moves, and we've talked about a little bit about stress in a recap. So in an acute standpoint, injury occurs, as we talked about, because it exceeds tissue tolerance. It's an overuse. We've overused the tissue. We've exceeded its capacity in that moment. What's happened is essentially we've had too much either load, repetition, or unknown movement, which unaccustomed stress that's been placed on the body. It's just been too much for the system at that time. The body was basically not prepared or able to do what it is told to do. It's as easy as that. What causes that? Three primary things. Number one, lack of knowledge of the current stress or fatigue level. We had no clue what the readiness of that person was if you're training yourself or if you're working with athletes or clients. If you don't know where they're at, then you have no idea whether you're placing too much or too little or about the right amount of stress on them. Number two, an improper warm-up and or recovery strategy. This is absolutely essential as well. Warm-ups are brutal in the industry. I'm just gonna be flat out honest. They're brutal because we don't have a rhyme or reason for a warm-up. We just say we're gonna move. But then we go to a workout, we put all this attention on what movements we're gonna use, what exercises we're gonna use, what's all this, but we don't do anything for that in the warm-up. We just swing our legs and we move our arms and shoulders and we do stuff, and we think as long as the body is warm, temperature-wise, then it's gonna function. That's not the case. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We're actually going to have a whole webinar on that coming up in October on how to create a more specific warm-up, more functional warm-up per person, more personalized. Okay, so lack of knowledge, we have no clue what the readiness is. Number two, horrible warm-up. If the warm-up is accurate, we actually you put the body in a position to tolerate more stress, and you're actually able to decrease how much stress the body is going to incur. That becomes more negative. That's what a warm-up should do. For us, we just think if it just increases sweat, we're good. And then programming strategy. And programming strategy is tied to all of that. What did I do with the person? What was the volume of the training session? And that's because I had a lack of knowledge of where they currently were, okay? All right, from a chronic standpoint, this one's gonna get a little bit detailed, so stay with me. Number one, they're under-recovered, means they have increased fatigue. When you have chronic injury, you have whether it's plantar fasciitis, whether you have a nagging hamstring issue, whether you have shoulder pain, pick one. The body is under-recovered. It has not gotten to a state of recovery, and that means there's increased fatigue / stress in the system, which means the inflammation has been prolonged. So we're talking about prolonged inflammation. That decreases what we talked about, that alpha gamma coactivation. That means we no longer have the instant activation to where the muscles are turning on. Those type 1 motor units are no longer turning on when they're supposed to. This means that we've had decreased muscle spindle sensitivity. That muscle spindle cannot shorten. It's got what we call slack in it. So if you see in this diagram, if you can see that, you'll see that there's on the far right with the yellow circle around it, there's a spindle that's just kind of hanging there. So think of yourself fishing. You take a fishing line and you throw it in the water. What's the first thing you do with the fishing line when you throw it in the water? You reel out the slack. Why? Because if there's slack in the line and a fish grabs a line, you have no idea if there's a fish on the line because there's so much slack. It could go for 10, 20 meters, 10, 20 yards or so before you ever, oh, there was something happen. That's slack. If there's slack in the spindle, it means the body's moving, but it has no idea that it's moving because it's not getting feedback. So it can't be stable. So when you reel that slack in, now you have a tight or taut line. You have instant connection. So as soon as a fish grabs the bait, boom, you can feel it and you can actually react. That's exactly what happens to muscle spindles. So when we have prolonged inflammation knocks the muscle spindle offline and it decreases that alpha gamma coactivation, so the muscle can no longer react in its instant timing. When that happens, that cascades down, we no longer have proprioception. We don't have that immediate ability to respond and produce a good movement pattern. Now we have decreased sensory motor integration. We're not able to get input in and good input out. And we've decreased reciprocal inhibition, which means we now have an unstable joint. That's what causes the instability. And that's where we have also changes in our type 1 metabolic characteristics. They change. So we have delayed activation, quicker to fatigue, instability. So what does that result in? Pay attention to this because this is the ultimate piece of information. When we have all of this happens, which is a result of prolonged inflammation, it's not if it will happen, it's usually when it's going to happen. And it will happen for most people. It's just some people, depending on their level of tolerance, can go longer, and a lot of people can't. But if you have nagging aches and pains, that means that you're in that state right there. It's resulted in weakened muscle tissue. We no longer have proper proprioception, muscle spindle activity. The muscle is in a weakened state. It cannot respond properly. It does not have the ability to activate on time when it needs to. This decreases what's called, this is just a fancy word, a reflex-mediated stiffness. It means the muscle no longer has the ability to properly activate to stabilize a joint. It can no longer be turned on to stiffen the tissue that's supposed to support our joints. It no longer has the ability to create the tension that it needs in order for the connective tissue to transfer that and hold the joint in its place. Muscles produce the force The connective tissue just transfers that. If we don't have immediate turn on, we don't have the ability for the joint to be in a stable position with active control from the muscular system. Destabilized joint, and it's the destabilized joint and the lack of proprioception and the weakened muscle that actually leads to muscle tightness. Muscle tightness is a protective mechanism because of the altered reciprocal inhibition, and that's how we get decreased range of motion. So we always look at decreased range of motion as we got tight muscles, but where did that come from? It came from the weakened muscle. It came from prolonged inflammation that knocks it offline and causes this, and I'm going to show you research on that here in a second. So just think now, if my muscle spindle isn't giving me information and I'm trying to extend my knee, as soon as that muscle spindle goes offline, because it may give me, and that's why people don't get tight at the beginning ranges of motion. So when someone's trying to extend their knee, it's not like instantly the knee can't move. It goes out, 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 and then all of a sudden it gets tight, more towards the end range. Why? Because that spindle can't shorten fully. So when that spindle stops giving information to the nervous system, that's when there's no longer an inhibition, the reciprocal inhibition of the opposing muscle groups to be decreased or to turn off. And so they turn on. And that's why all of a sudden they turn on. So the issue is the spindle is no longer activated. If you reboot that spindle, you'll get the tissue, the opposing tissue, to remain off or in a decreased state, so you have full range of motion and you'll have a stable joint. So the note here is inflammation, the prolonged inflammation, leads directly to muscle weakness. And that weakness is what causes the muscle tightness. So if you address the weakness, you will remove the tightness. That's neurophysiology. And we'll go more. I'll explain that more. What's the cause of chronic injury? Incomplete, improper recovery strategies. That's it. It's the body hasn't been put in a position to allow itself to recover because it's still moving. Even though you may have technology that says that you're in a good state of readiness, and this is where technology hasn't caught up to the body yet, because the body's designed far greater than technology is. If you have a Whoop or you have some type of technology, whether it's heart rate variability, or whether you have, even if you're using some type of velocity-based training, and wow, they can still move as fast, that doesn't mean, or you have a good readiness score, that doesn't mean that everything that's supposed to be working is going to work right. That's why those won't necessarily eliminate or overcome some of these nagging injuries just by doing that, because you can still present as strong. But strength doesn't necessarily mean that everything is working the way it's supposed to. That's why things get broken. That's why athletes get broken. And let's face it, a lot of the stuff that I'm going to talk about, you'll see at the end, has come from Greg Roscoff and what's called muscle activation technique. And you have access to that, and I'll talk about that at the end. But he's been doing this for 20 years. He's so far ahead of the game. But the essential thing that we have to realize is stress is not just physical. Life is going to beat you up, and you will succumb to stress, whether you like it. It doesn't matter how mentally strong you are, how emotionally strong you are. You'll get so much stress that the body is going to break down. And what I love about what Greg has always said is that when it breaks down, you need to have someone there to put it back together, or to turn it back on, or to connect the battery cables, or to reel in the slack on the line. If you don't know how to do that, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot, and/or we're just being inefficient and wasting time, and we can get to that. And what we're talking about here, this is something that I have used personally with clients, and I've used personally on myself in 2 different capacities, and I've also had Greg work on me. So I've seen this work in 3 different mediums, 1 from the expert and 2 from a knucklehead like me, who's gotten amazing results with what we're going to talk about today. And that's why I'm so passionate about helping you to get that with yourself and or your clients. So let's go a little step farther. Let's look at the stress response to training, because most people don't even understand this. So when we train And this is, yes, especially with eccentric contractions, because most people do that, but it's even with concentric contractions, just not to the degree. There's a normal level of inflammation. That's the red line you'll see with those triangles. There's a normal inflammation response. So we want that. You have to have that. But there's also, because of that, there's going to be a hindrance in your strength and range of motion. That's what's circled down there below. Strength and range of motion will decrease. This is in a normal training situation. The pain, which is the open triangle, and the range of motion are correlated. So inflammation causes pain. Pain is a result of inflammation. So as soon as we start getting inflammation, after the inflammation is kicked in, all of a sudden pain starts going up really high. There's a correlation between that, which all that means is that there's an inflammation response and your decreased range of motion. That's normal. So in a normal case, as the inflammation rises, it's cleaning and repairing. So you can see everything's starting to reduce. And if this went longer, you would see that they would come back to a baseline or change. So the inflammation is necessary because inflammation brings healing to the body. That's how the body heals, is through inflammation. Inflammation decreases the muscle's ability to activate, though. That's why we lose range of motion. When we can't decrease the inflammation and get it out soon enough or completely or to the right level, that's where we have the continued deactivation. That's how the muscle spindle gets knocked offline, and all of a sudden we lose the ability to move into a motion, which means we lose reciprocal inhibition, and that's how we get tightness somewhere else. Okay? So now looking at inflammation, I already told you it'll short circuit your alpha gamma coactivation. It'll knock the spindles offline, especially in the type 1 muscle fibers, because they're the lowest threshold, and it'll cause poor proprioception. This is just a study that shows, and this is actually a great article, and it lays out everything in perfect, and the references down there. All these things, but I highlighted inflammation because aging, cancer, infection, pain, trauma, those are all related to inflammation. So they should have just put inflammation are known to be associated with impaired proprioception. And remember, proprioception means that the body is no longer able to have proper input, so it can't have proper output. That's what it's saying. It means that we have knocked the spindle offline, is what that's saying. Inflammation has knocked the spindle offline, because this is actually an article about spindles. So this puts the muscle in a weakened state, unable to contract on demand, and the muscle spindles are no longer sending the proper signals. So here you can see that this disruption that we talked about, the whole inflammation and the lack of proprioception, can be seen in the movements and the muscle activation that's not being effectively produced to create the proper outcome of things turning on and turning off, is what it's talking about. Things aren't turning on and turning off, so what's happening is everything's starting to lock down. And that's where we get the altered muscle spindle input, alters reciprocal inhibition, causing tightness in opposing muscles, and that's what it's referring to here with the lack of degrees of freedom. It means we no longer can move to the way that we're supposed to move. We don't have the range of motion because inflammation has knocked the spindle offline, altering proprioception, altering information to the brain. Sensory motor integration is no longer working because we have a bad input, we're going to have a bad output, which means we've altered reciprocal inhibition. We no longer can get things to turn on and turn off properly. So we have tightness. So note, muscle weakness causes a destabilized joint, which leads to the tightness in opposing muscle groups and lack of range of motion. Okay. Now, in a prolonged stress response, here's what happens. Here's just kind of a very simplistic chain of what happens. When we have this prolonged stress response, it means we have prolonged stress response and prolonged inflammation. We've altered the immune system function. We have the inability to downregulate inflammation, which is the #1 factor promoting musculoskeletal injury and all major diseases for that matter. 2, it decreases recruitment of type 1 muscle fibers and muscle spindles. That decreases our stability or proprioception, which is how we ultimately get mobility. Mobility shouldn't be thought of as range of motion. It should be thought of as actively controlled range of motion. is what it should be thought. We think if I can just get more motion to happen, that means that I have mobility. No, it just means you got more motion to happen. That's typically what we do a lot of times by doing aggressive maneuvers, aggressive mobility drills, or aggressive stretching tactics. You can gain range of motion, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's actually proprioceptive, or you've gotten proper proprioception out of that range of motion. And that's the difference. And it's not that stretching and mobility drills and all that, those aren't bad. The exercise is never the problem. It's the person or the prescription of those for that person that becomes the problem. Did they do them, one, in a proper order, or did they do them to the right ability level of who they're working with or themselves? That's the issue. Exercises aren't problems. It's how they're used that becomes the problem. That's a human error. The third thing is we have dehydrated connective tissue. When we have a prolonged stress response, the connective tissue is now dehydrated. So let's walk through this. I have inflammation. I have decreased muscle contraction ability. I can't turn the muscles on at the right time to stabilize the joint. Muscles work with connective tissue, your fascial matrix. Muscles produce force. Connective tissue only transfers force. If the muscle can't turn on at the right time, that joint's still moving because it's either responding to forces placed upon it or it's being told to move. So it's gonna move, and if we have a delay, that means you have an unstable joint. The connective tissue is still attached to that joint. So the connective tissue is now trying to do the job that the muscle is supposed to be doing and helping it with. So now there's more force placed on connective tissue, but the connective tissue is dehydrated, so it no longer has the capacity to actually transfer or sustain force, or what we call stiffen properly. So if I have poor tissue and poor muscle, now the connective tissue is where all the stress is being placed on. What's the number one tissue in the body that's injured in musculoskeletal injury? Connective tissue. That's why. And it's not because the connective tissue is weak, it's because the muscle isn't firing on time. It's not activated. That's where the issue lies. So that being said, just to make sure that we're all on track here, what I want to know from you guys is real quick pop quiz. Inflammation leads directly to what? Muscle weakness or muscle tightness? Okay, interesting. So we have a 60-40 split. 60 people said muscle weakness, 40% of people said muscle tightness. Ladies and gentlemen, what I've been saying this whole time is that prolonged inflammation leads to muscle weakness. Prolonged inflammation leads directly to muscle weakness. The muscle weakness is what causes muscle tightness. Muscle tightness only exists because there's muscle weakness. The prolonged inflammation doesn't cause the muscle to be tight. It causes the muscle to be weak, which reciprocally inhibits other muscles to become tight. So when you walk away from this, and this is a paradigm shift because we live in a tightness is the cause philosophy, because we live in a muscles have to lengthen philosophy. Muscles have to shorten and lengthen. And in order for something to lengthen, something else has to shorten. If that doesn't shorten, the other thing's not going to lengthen. So when you find muscle tightness, that's not because something happened to the muscle to create tightness. You have to go, well, what caused the tightness? Inflammation doesn't cause tightness. Inflammation causes a decrease in range of motion. That was the whole graph that I showed you. A lack of strength and a lack of range of motion, which are correlated. And I don't have the ability of the spindle to activate, because this slide right here shows that the inflammation creates impaired proprioception, knocks spindles offline, and that's what knocks the activation offline and knocks the reciprocal inhibition offline. If I can't reciprocally inhibit because the muscle is offline, it's weak, then I can't lengthen the other muscle. So just lengthening the other muscle, you may get more length out of it, but you never turn the spindle back on. So if that spindle in the opposing muscle never turns on, that tightness will always come back. It'll always come back. It'll keep coming back. It'll keep coming back, or it'll start going to other areas, because I don't want to get overly complicated, but motor units, there are multiple motor units that turn on that affects more than just one muscle. So the quad doesn't just, hamstring tightness isn't caused by a tight quad necessarily. It can be caused by quite a few different weaknesses in the body. So that's why you have to have some type of process. So I hope that makes sense, because I would hate for you people to leave here thinking that tightness is what is the problem. Tightness isn't the problem. Tightness is a symptom. Tightness and pain are symptoms of something else that's happening. And that symptom is prolonged inflammation that's creating a weakened muscle state that's then leading to symptoms. So I hope that makes sense for you guys. Okay, so let's prevent and overcome the injuries. We already talked about this in number one, but this is, so go back and look at part one on this, but it's what we call the raw score. You have to have a way of assessing someone's recovery and assessing their state of fatigue. So in this, we just take you through four different pillars of information, and you rate yourself on a scale of 1 to 3. How's your sleep? And there's the qualification. How's your body physically? There's the qualification. How's your mood? And how's your nutrition? Based on that score, which is this is all relative to scientific research. So this is all validated through science. This information has been around for probably about 30 years now. It's just, we don't do it. It's never been introduced, but using this, you will be in a very close proximity of where you are or where your client is when you train them. And so based upon what their level is or their score, if they're a 10 to 12, they have minimal stress. So you can pretty much do whatever you've assigned for them to do from a volume standpoint that day. It means they're prepared from a perception of stress that day. 7 to 9 is moderate stress, 4 to 6 is a lot of stress. So all you do from that is then you take that information. Your raw score tells you how much water is in their bucket right now. So that tells you how much training volume you can add to that. If they have a whole lot of water, they're a 4 to 6, then you can only have a little bit of training volume that goes into that. So you have to reduce their volume. If you have a low amount of water, then you have a lot of area for added stress. So that's how that works. This document is in the, or you can download this document off our website. It's in the, we have a downloadable PDF with the link on there, and we talked about it in more detail in the last one. There's also assessing joint mobility or your range of motion, and this comes specifically from Greg Broskoff's muscle activation technique. And I thank Greg, as I always do, 1 for his brilliance, but 2 for his generosity in letting Eleiko, myself included, using his Jumpstart program, being able to take it and use movement patterns from that so that we can assess range of motion. And when you assess range of motion, when you find a lack of range of motion, which we've already talked about for the last, 45 minutes, when we talk about the range of motion and lack of, that means that things aren't turning on properly. So we can now have a way to assess that, and that's due to prolonged inflammation. So this is a something that you can do on yourself. And just so you know, I've used his Jumpstart process on myself personally and done it with me personally, and I've had amazing results. I had a couple of injuries, and I won't go into detail, that I just couldn't figure out with all the things that I knew. And after talking with Greg and going through the Jumpstart process, I did it on myself, and I kid you not, that day after I did this on myself, I went out and was able to run. I couldn't walk downstairs. I couldn't walk up or downstairs with my left knee. My left knee, it just like all of a sudden, it's like someone blew it out. I couldn't figure it out. I had no stability, no joint stability. I had no ability to put force or load on it. I couldn't work out. I could hardly walk. I was limping. And that was about, I don't know what it was, 2.5, 3 years ago. I did the whole thing. And that day I went out and I with my girls to the ranch, and I felt pretty good. So I started jogging, and I had, on a scale of 1 to 10, I had a 1 in pain. Barely anything. And since that, I've never had pain again. As long as I go through my process and I do my range of motion, I do my activation, I don't have that issue anymore. not a tightness issue, it was just pure range of motion. I have tons of stories that I could go through, but essentially what we have to do is we have to be able to turn that process back on. We have to be able to get the body to get into that motion. So what we talk about is, in his process, they're called a positional isometric contraction. And what we're doing is you're going to reset that muscle spindle, which means you're going to turn reciprocal inhibition back on. So a muscle turns on, the opposing muscle that is tight turns off. And that's how you eliminate movement. And it's instant and it works. If you do it right, it works. I got dozens of stories. You reset the spindle and you reactivate the muscle. It means you've reestablished the alpha gamma coactivation. That immediately improves stability, mobility, and range of motion all at once. So you've done everything at one time without sacrificing anything else and without doing something that overrides the system. You're doing something that reboots the system. The procedure is very simple. You place the muscle in its shortened position. So if I'm doing left rotation with my trunk, if I go to left rotation, I keep it in left rotation and I try to push into left rotation. And I do that with a very low intensity, longer duration isometric contraction. And when I say intensity, it's a 10 to 20%. Why? Because if you get over 30%, you're going to bring in type 2A fibers. You don't want the type 2As to kick in. You want the type 1s to kick in because those are the ones that get knocked offline predominantly. So it's a 1 to 2 on a scale of 10 of maximal contraction, isometric contraction. And you do it for 3 to 6 seconds. So sometimes you have to build up to that, maybe 3 sets of 3 seconds, and then you build up to eventually you're doing 6 sets of 6 seconds. So don't try to do everything to the max at the first time, just give it a few. We teach this in our course. So we have a readiness and recovery training course, which is online, which you guys have access to, and I'll show you in a second, in that download in our online courses. And we go through this self process. So you're doing it on yourself, and you can have your client and you can watch them do it on themselves if you want to. You'll also have the ability, and there's another link on there to the MAT, the MAT muscle activation technique, through Greg Roscoff, to their jumpstart process, which is a manual process, which has it's to a greater degree. So that's where you get into being able to do some muscle testing. So you'll be able to test in that position and see that it's weak. You'll be able to test that weakness and then apply the same principles as we're doing here, and then you can retest and you can see the instant change and they can feel the instant change. So if you're more of a manual person, I highly recommend that you go through the jumpstart process. Even if you're not, even if you're just looking for more information, more detail, it's still a phenomenal process and it's super cheap. You get a 20% discount off through Eleiko, so use that as well. So the practical application, always think of, if I can't get into that motion, I want to activate into that motion, not try to stretch the opposing, because while you may increase range of motion, you have not reset the spindles, so you don't have proprioception. You still won't have the proper stability of a joint. That is vital. It's the joint stability that we need and the proper proprioception that the body has to have. Otherwise, what happens is that's going to start shooting all over the place. You may heal this area, but then all of a sudden something else goes wrong. That's because the body is going to keep going where it senses instability and it senses that there's a weakness. So take care of the weakness. And then another thing that we do use, this is just examples. So if you're trying to increase your hamstring flexibility in this one, and please, this is super, super simple, because there are more things that can be done here than just doing this hip flexion for hamstring range of motion. But if you do that, you're actually doing an isometric contraction into hip flexion. So you can see my hand on the front of my thigh. That's what I'm actually activating. If I want to increase the quad flex, or my quad extensibility, then I can go on a hamstring, and you'll be surprised how many people's hamstrings are weak and they can hardly do that. And a lot of times people's hamstrings cramp. I find that a lot with clients. At a very low level, they can hardly do it. Cramping is an indication your body has no clue what it's doing. It has no clue what's happening. So that means that the spindle, it's just like, I don't know what to do. That cramping will go away. Just don't beat it up with somebody, because that's not the best experience in a hamstring, but it will go away. Shoulder internal range of motion, you're trying to get into shoulder internal range of motion, activate the internal range of motion, activate the muscles that are moving into that. It works phenomenally. Trust me from experience. Okay. Another thing that you can do is use the foam roll. And when I say foam roll is we look at assessing the pain. So we do kind of a perceived pain in the tissue. So we have inflammation causes pain. Pain is a result of inflammation. So we go through the body and we look at where is the pain located. So that's areas that have high inflammation. So the main purpose for foam rolling is create circulation and lubrication. People are like, oh, you gotta get range of motion beyond there for like 90 seconds. I'm gonna tell you right now, I've been doing this for years. You don't need to spend more than 5 to 15 seconds on a specific area. One, that decreases how much force you're putting into the tissue, which is stress, which can actually potentially shut the tissue down and actually create a weakness. So 5 to 15 seconds on an area if you're gonna foam roll something. And then if you have a trigger point, which a lot of people do, there's a whole process right there that you can look at. We teach all this in our course of Ready Recovery. We go through the whole process. But essentially from a practical application, what we're really doing is we're just trying to roll on specific areas that need some love, but very minimal, just to move tissue around, because tissue has to be lubricated. And we talked about that in more detail in the first part. So last thing, the prevention process, that raw score should tell you what your stress is, and that should determine the volume of training that you use in your training session. Your mobility assessment should help with your tissue function and should be part of your warm-up process. And the tissue pain should also be part of a warm-up process when you have time to help create the lubrication of the tissue, and it can actually help create a little bit of circulation as well. So what we talk about at Eleiko in our courses is we have a simple process. We'll use the foam roll to address some key areas and to create some lubrication. And by the way, you can foam roll your whole body in less than 2.5 minutes. I have a video and you have a link to it where in 2 minutes, 15 seconds, you can go through your whole body without killing it. And then we do the activation afterwards. So if you're doing foam roll, you can do activation afterwards, and that can reboot anything that may have been shut down or anything you may shut down, and then we get into different mobility strategies. So what we have in our warm-up cool-down strategy, we have tissue preparation and we have movement preparation. And the movement preparation, those mobilizers are slow and low, range of motion, slow speed, and then the dynamic or fast and higher. There's a continuum of things that you can do to address the body. Most people just have mobility stuff they do, or they do static stretching. We actually do low-grade mobilizers, which are very slow, low speed and low range of motion that places minimal stress on the tissue and just allows it to kind of move without threatening everything. And those have fantastic ability. So depending on who you're working with should determine what types of strategies that you're using. You don't have to use the whole process. Choose one of these or both of them. It's up to you and it's up to the situation. And like I said, in our online course, we talk about how to use them, what to look for, what are the factors that would determine what I need to do. If I could only do one thing, and this speaking from experience, if I could only do one thing, it'd be activation. That would be the one thing that I would do. Because get range of motion, because I go through, in my warm-ups, I'll go through 10 to 15 different motions is what I'll do. And depending on what the day is, I might go through a full gamut of them, where there may be more, but 10 to 15 ranges of motion. And what I've done is, one, I've moved, so I have a movement capacity, but I've also turned on what wasn't working. So not only have I moved and warmed the body up, which you will get a warming up, but I've activated what hasn't been activated. So I'm just giving you my personal preference. And so with that, I'm just going to go ahead and go right to the end because I don't want to belabor this. There's a few, sorry about that. And I'll end with the final slide right there. Now, I want to get to some questions. I know that we're running out of time and we're slightly over, and I deeply appreciate your guys' patience. There's just so much information around this. There's so much going on. So I got some questions here. So I'm going to answer some questions. If you can stay on, great. If you can't, this will be recorded and you can see the recording of it later on. Joe Dunce, I see that you asked a question, how is this measured and remeasured? At what point does become an issue? I'm not sure what you're talking about there. Do you have the study links? In the readiness recovery course, we have a full list of references for you. So all the references are located there. And I don't know what you mean by 18%. So Joe, I don't see, I don't know what your questions are referring to, so I apologize. So if nobody else has any questions, then I'll assume that you guys had a fair bit of information there. And the last thing I'll ask for you guys, if you want to answer it, is what must happen to address muscle weakness? Do we reset the muscle spindle with muscle activation, or do we stretch the muscle into a greater range of motion? Which one of those actually addresses the muscle weakness that's caused by inflammation? Excellent, we got a much higher degree. So those of you that answered stretch the muscle into greater range of motion, you may not have got the full gist of the webinar that we were talking about. Stretching a muscle will override the system. It doesn't necessarily reboot the spindle that's being disconnected. It's not that stretching is bad. It can be a great thing because it's just a form of moving. But if something is in a weakened, or something is tight, it's because something else is in a weakened state. You need to find the weakened stated muscle. You need to find that in order to address the issue. So we need to reset and reactivate tissue when we have a lack of range of motion versus trying to just push things. And it's not that you can't push things. You can push all that want to, but you better find out what's deactivated, because that's, again, that joint will still be unstable, and that will lead to more problems down the line. Thank you guys very much. Please download that file. If you don't have access to download it off this, just send us an email and I will attach the file for you. There's also a link in there to Feel Soma. Feel Soma is a company that I started with a guy named Ian O'Dwyer in Australia, and we go through a lot of the mobilizers, low rhythmical motions and foam rolling techniques that can be helpful and beneficial in conjunction with other things that we do. So that's all in there. Thank you very much for all of your time, and we appreciate you being part of the Eleiko family. We hope to see you in our next webinar, which will be on September 18th at the same time on a Wednesday, September 18th at 1 p.m. Eastern time. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.